on a daily basis, but I want to smooth out the ups and downs a little bit. So I maybe want to take a 7-day rolling average or a 6-month rolling average, whatever it might be. So those are the 5 we're going to look at in this session. Just before we do, I want to take a step back and take a little bit of a look at the calculation engine within Pyramid. Within Pyramid, I can create calculations at 3 different levels, what we call granular, semantic, and context. The granular calculations are where I'm performing effectively row-level calculations based on my source data. Typically, this is where I'm perhaps extracting data from multiple systems and blending it together to perform, to create an analytic model with that data. And I want to be able to create calculations at the row level in terms of the source data that I'm accessing. For this, I can define a data flow in the model app within Pyramid, and then create calculations as the data flows through. At the record level, I can create calculations between the different fields in my table on a row by row basis. The second area is where we're looking at what we call semantic calculations. And semantic calculations, we're going to be focusing on today, are constructed through the Formulate app. And this allows me to create calculations based on the model metadata. So for example, if I'm looking at a measure like sales, I'll be creating an aggregate type model. So when I'm looking at it by country or by month or by product category or by manufacturer, then I'll get the totals for that. I may also create a model based on an averaging approach, an averaging aggregate function. So for example, something like margin, it doesn't make sense to add margins up. So I'm going to look at the average by country, by time, by manufacturer, by product category, for example. And semantic calculations can easily be saved and reused and shared throughout the Pyramid platform and operate effectively on the aggregate model that I've created using the model app. The final piece is what we call context calculations. These are available within the Discover app itself, where I'm dragging and dropping items to create my query and create the visualization that I want. And context calculations work in the context of the query itself. So they operate only against the data which is retrieved from the query, rather than the working against the semantic model and effectively the entire data set, or against the individual row level items as we would with my model app. So there's different requirements for each. There's pros and cons for each option. Some types of calculations are required to be done at the granular level. Some more easily done at semantic level, and obviously easiest of all in terms of the simple number of clicks, the context calculations. But as we'll see, going through some of the examples, some require to be done at a particular level, others you have somewhat of a choice. So again, depending exactly what you want to do, there are options in terms of where I define that particular calculation. So if you have a look at the granular level, then we can see something like my revenue here. We have a number of calculated items: transaction profit, transaction gross margin, and the revenue. And if you take the revenue example, or if you like, my line item total, this is typically where I'd see something at a till at a supermarket, where I'm selling a number of units of item at a particular price. And obviously my sale for that particular line item is going to be price times quantity. No, it doesn't make any sense to do this at the semantic level, because my total price or average price by country times the total number I've sold is not going to make any sense. It has to be at that row level. So in this case, when we're looking at those totals, then I have to do this calculation at the row level in the model app. When I'm looking at my aggregation rules, again, I'm then adding up my transaction profit, I'm averaging my gross margin, and I'm adding up or summing my revenue in terms of the model that I'm creating. My semantic calculations, though, can be created and calculated at the aggregate level. So in this case, as we see, my transaction profit, transaction gross margin, transaction revenue can be calculated at the row level, and my model will aggregate those as I look at it by country, by time, by product. My profit values, though, I can define can be calculated at the aggregate level. So again, whether I'm actually adding them up or averaging them, that will produce the right answer. And indeed, I can then apply that calculation at the aggregate level in terms of sales minus expenses, transaction profit divided by sales, and price times quantity in terms of my revenue. And in the context calculation, as mentioned earlier, here I can create a calculation directly in my query app, in my Discover app, by simply right-clicking on the measure concerned, for example, like regional sales, and asking it to create a percentage of total. Now, it's important to understand the example here on the left as I'm looking at that percentage of total in the context of the query. So you can see it will always add up to 100%. So if I took France out of the equation, for example, then my total would be, or that grand total minus France, and obviously my percentages would still add up to 100%. So rather than looking at, what's the percentage of France to its parent, i.e. the grand total, I'm saying, what is the percentage versus the total that's being displayed as the query itself. So the semantic calculations are linked effectively to what's appearing in my grid or in my chart, i.e. the results of my calculation. My semantic calculations are applied at the model level and can be applied across different dimensionality of my queries. And my granular calculations have to be performed at the row level as part of the creation and building of my analytic model. So to actually create my calculations, I'm going to use the Formulate app. And the Formulate app allows me as a starting point to create a number of different things. It allows me to build individual formulas in my measures dimension, if you like. I can also build formulas in any other dimension as well. The result of my formula will effectively be a single value or single member value, and just has that single item as the result. I can also create dynamic lists where I'm going to return a list of values, a list of members of a particular attribute, for example. It could be, for example, like top N products. It will then give me a list of 10 products. I can name that list, and that list will be evaluated at runtime with whatever the data is as it's being refreshed. I can also use the Formulate module to build KPIs, and these are true KPIs with an actual value, a target value, and a status value, which is calculated by defining the relationship between actual and target. Could be a difference, a variance, a ratio, whatever it might be. And I can assign that to different bands for gauges and color-coded output. The Formulate also allows me to create effectively variables or parameters, and these can be parameters which apply to elements which are going to be injected into my formula, or they could also be as a model parameter. They could also be a simple numeric or text value, which also gets injected into the calculation. In this case, that'd be called a global parameter. I can also use Formulate to create scripts for machine learning in R and Python, and also to create custom visualizations in Pyramid using JavaScript, our API, and the D3 graphics libraries. Now, obviously, all of that, not be able to cover all of this today. We're going to be focusing on the first of those of creating the formulas. No doubt we'll put another session up in a month or two looking at dynamic lists and KPIs to actually look at a bit more detail at those. But certainly, we're going to be focusing today on the formula aspect of my formula to create calculations in my measures dimension, doing calculations with the two numeric items, and also calculations across other dimensions as well, like time, country, geography, product, and so on. So my formula when I create a calculation, is linked to a data model. So the reason it's called a semantic calculation is because it's linked to the semantic definition of the data I'm working with. So that semantic model defines my business dimensions, product, time, geography, etc., as well as the numeric items I'm analyzing by. So in this case, things like sales, profit, margin, and so on. When I create a calculation, I can save it in a private workspace or in a shared workspace, either my work group or a public folder, if I've been given right access to that folder by the administrator. The calculations, as mentioned already, can be created as measures or as new attribute elements or members within a particular dimension. The formula options I have in terms of the functions I can apply are dependent on the type of data source that Pyramid is pointed at that time. Pyramid supports direct query capability and dynamic calculation ability into both multidimensional OLAP systems like SQL Server Analysis Services or SAP BW, or SQL data sources like Oracle DB2 SQL Server, and also Pyramid's own in-memory engine, IMDb. IMDb itself is simply a column store SQL database sitting in RAM. We read from it and perform queries against it in exactly the same way as we do any other SQL database. From an OLAP point of view, then we will generate MDX, multidimensional expressions, and submit those to the underlying engine for it to execute and perform the calculations and return the result set to me. For SQL-type databases, Pyramid will actually generate something called PQL, Pyramid Query Language or Expression Language. This, in turn, is then decomposed and deconstructed into one or more SQL queries by the Pyramid calculation engine, Piranha. Those queries are then executed against the underlying SQL database, and then, if required, we will stitch the results back together to give the final answer back to the user. Exactly how much of that gets pushed back to the underlying database engine will depend on the calculation concerned, but it's usually a pretty high percentage of that. And in the case of MDX, it will be 100%. Formula objects can be combined with other Formulate object types. So again, I can take the result of one calculation, feed it into the next, or take the result of one calculation, feed it into the definition of a dynamic list, and so on. Again, in this case, when I have calculations on calculations, I can explicitly define the order in which the calculations are performed using the solve order parameter as part of my calculation. So let's get started then, and we're going to sort of switch between slide and demo. So we'll take a look initially at what it looks like from the outset, give us a bit of an insight, and then we'll work through that example live against our demo system. So you'll see in this case, we're wanting to create a year-to-date, month-to-date, or week-to-date aggregate. There's a set of time-oriented functions or date blocks that you can see in terms of the functions within Formulate. And here we can create and look at things like current period. Current period function will actually match today's date into a date field and match that into your semantic model. I can also look at the full month for looking basically at any date and then calculate the full month from that date, and also obviously the quarter to date, week to date, and year to date values. So in this case, we can take a sum, we're just looking at the month to date value, and we can see the output of this. In fact, for looking at a number of dates, I can look at that as that month to date value. If I don't specify the measure to work with, then Pyramid will use the default measure, in this case, sales, and the default measure is specified as part of your semantic model. So when I build my model out, I can define which is my default measure. And if I don't mention the measure, if it's an optional parameter in any of my functions, then it will default to the default measure and use that to perform its calculations. We can also explicitly change that to something else by using the optional argument for that particular measure. So in this case, we're looking at the actual what gets output and created by Pyramid in this case. We're asking it to look at a series of dates. In fact, we've got date on my rows in this case. And we're applying the month to date function for each of those rows. And that's what the current member function also appended to that will perform. The one which I pass to my month to date function indicates to start on the 1st of the month. So again, we can vary that if we wish. If my month always starts on the 5th of the month, then we can put a number 5 in there, and it'll give me a month to date from day 5 of the month to the current date. The month to date function will return a list of dates from the beginning of the month to the current date, either in context in my grid or defined in a filter. The week to date will return a set of dates from the beginning of the week, and the year to date a set of dates from the beginning of the year. Obviously, then we have to add those up. We can use the sum function, or we can use the aggregate function. In this case, we've used the sum function. There is a subtle difference between the two. Aggregate will respect the aggregation function as defined in your model. So if I was working with margin, which is an averaging aggregation, then aggregate will give me the average in terms of the month to date, whereas sum will just simply dumbly add everything up. So typically I would actually use the aggregate function by default, but in this particular case, I've chosen to use the pure sum one. So let's just switch my location. Let's just drop into Pyramid. And what I want to do is to, first of all, I'm also going to go and query my underlying database. I'm going to look in this case for my sales and store online. This option here, my most recent ones, the various models I've accessed recently. In this case, I'm going to choose my sales store and online. And we can obviously start querying my database. Now, there's actually two ways to get to my Formulate app. Let's just get rid of that. We're here now. I can create a new calculation and Formulate here. So I can choose new formulation. I want to create a formula, and I want to choose the model I want to build it against. And then I can start building out my calculation. I can also have a shortcut method to here as well. So if I'm here working in my discovery mode here, then there's a little FX button, and if I click on the drop down, I can choose what I want to actually create. And in fact, on the FX button, when I'm looking outside the measures dimension, I can also create a dynamic list here as well. So the only difference, obviously, is a shortcut. I've already opened for querying my sales store and online model. If I choose to create a new formula in my measures dimension here, it will take me straight into my Formulate, again, working against that particular model. So it's just a kind of a shortcut from one to the other. So let's just nip back to my discovery. I have a set of things in here. I've got the date field here. And if I drop that into my grid, we can see I get my list of dates. And indeed, in this case, what I could do then is to put a value against it. Let's put sales in. And that's just going to change my grid design, make it a bit clearer here. And we can also make that a little bit bigger. So you can see here, I've got the individual totals of sales for each of those dates. Now, obviously, I can break this down further if I wish to by looking at my other items in here. So, for example, in this case, I could take my country, for example, and drop that into my columns. And you can see how that breaks down on a daily basis for each of those. But in this case, I'm just going to stay with just my individual dates. And what I want to do is build a month to date calculation, which will give me the total sales for each date that appears in my grid. So that's what I want to do. In this case, then I can go to my calculation. We can see I have element blocks in my Formulate app here, and these will refer to a data point. So a data point will normally consist of a measure like sales, and then the other dimensional index, if you like, to specify which particular version of sales I'm interested in. So if I wanted to look at the total sales for the US, for example, here, and I look at my country and specify the United States, it creates what in dimensional time terms, calculations we term a tuple. So this is effectively the sales for the United States, or I could refer, for example, in this case, maybe to my data items and look in my time intelligence folder. I could take year and take, for example, 2017. So now this block refers to is sales for 2017 for the United States. So that's the way you can actually access a particular data point. In this case, we wanting to do some aggregation and based around a date. So I'm just going to delete that one here. My aggregation blocks allow me to aggregate averages, maximums, minimums, standard deviations, and so on. But in this case, if we look at my date blocks, this is where I'll find my date time type functions. And in this case, as we saw on the slide, we've got a number of functions here looking at full quarter, month, etc. What we're interested in is my month to date. So if I drag my month to date block in, then my month to date block, I want to choose the date field. So that's the one we're actually applying to. And if I choose any particular date, it will calculate the month to date for that value. But rather than do that, what I'm also interested in here, I want to get a month to date value for each of the dates that are in my rows. So effectively what I want to use, if you like, is something which we call the current member. So a current member working within the query and within the grid will give me or apply the calculation to every instance of date that appears in the grid, whether it's the rows or the columns, or if it's not in the rows or columns, if it's in the filters, will also trigger that current member capability. So again, let's do that. Let's take, go back to my item here, and you'll notice in my calculation windows, I got my element selection. If I choose a specific date, but what I want to do is choose each of the dates that appears in my grid. So there's a little FX button here, and this allows me to choose what we call relative values or positional values of my particular attribute. So in this case, I want to choose the current member item here. Now, creating that month to date, if I were to execute that now, you'll find that it actually gives me an error. So it's actually telling me that this month to date function actually returns a set. In fact, when we were discussing this on the slide, we mentioned that. So month to date will return the set of dates from the beginning of the month to the whatever is the current value I'm looking at. So obviously that's returning a set, so we need to aggregate that together. So again, there's a set of functions here. Again, in terms of my math items and my statistical items, I've got an aggregate function. If I drag that in, you can see that aggregate is expecting a list and optional data point in terms of the measure that I'm working with. So in this case, we've got our list here. So we can actually just take the rest of that out. And I can simply say then, well, just give me the aggregate of the set of dates that are going to be returned by my month to date block. Again, to preview the output of that, I click on my period icon, and you can see the calculation evaluated to an empty result. Now, again, in this case, I could leave it in that way, that state here. So again, if I go and look at my aggregate function, I just drag that in again, you can see it's given me an optional data point that I can actually apply to the function. In this particular case, because I'm looking at sales, I could just leave it without, and it will default to sales because that's the default measure in this particular model. It's also evaluating to empty because at the moment when I'm executing this, there's no context for my current member. Pyramid doesn't know yet what it is, so therefore it's not going to do any particular calculation. It says I can't really calculate it because I don't know what the current date is at the moment, or the current member for the date. It has, though, successfully passed the syntax checker, so we know syntactically it's okay. It's just that it can't be evaluated right now because I don't have a current member for date. So let's save this. Now, when I save my calculation, I can save it into my own workspace in terms of my content, or I can save it into shared workspaces. And in Pyramid, I will have read-write access to a series of folders, one for each of the roles of which I'm a member. So I can actually share content with my peers in my work group for that function. I could also save it into a public folder if I have write access to that folder as defined by my administrator. And anybody with access either to the shared work group I save it in or the public folder I save it in, when they're working against this model, that calculation will be available for them to use. In this case, I'm going to just save it into my own content. I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call this one 5 calculations. And we're going to save it into that folder here. So this is going to be my month to date. And I'm going to choose save. So if I go back to my Discover view here, you can see my little FX folder has popped up now, indicating that there are calculated items available for this semantic model. And if I click on that and look into my content and 5 calculations, we'll see my month to date value showing up here. And if I check that box, then Pyramid will actually calculate those for me. There we go. So we can see in this case that my dates start on the 28th of October 2017, and then we're providing a month-to-date value for each of these leading up to the end of the month. Then, of course, at the month level, it resets beginning of the new month to give from the first of the month, if you remember. We could change that a little bit. Let's go back to my month-to-date calculation. Remember, we said we could provide another value in here. So if we made it, for example, 5, and just test that one, and then save it, and then come back and re-execute that query, then we should see that being changed. What's the date? 5. That's not quite right, is it? Okay. What's the date on that one? Okay, it's in that block. That's why. Okay, we'll leave that. So slightly different usage on the blocks versus the actual month-to-date calc itself. So in this case, we're actually saving that to the month-to-date, and we're saying aggregating that for my sales. If I wanted to do it for a different measure rather than sales, then I can put another measure in here as well. So again, I could go back to my element blocks, and what I'd like to do in here is just put a comment, bring an additional measure in here, and choose a different item. So let's say, for example, units. And I can save that and rename it to a month to date for units. Again, I'm just going to save that in this case. And when I come back to here and execute that, we're now actually seeing the aggregate for units rather than for sales. So again, you can define which of those measures you actually want to define that month to date value for. Now, in this case, as I said, current member is applying this. I'm seeing that calculated for each of my dates. I could alternatively take my date and move that into the filter. So let's do that. Let's move date and move that into my filter. And now I can choose any particular date on here using our date picker. And let's say I'm looking in this case at 2020 here. Let's look at the 3rd. In this case, I don't multi-select. Let's leave that to the 3rd, for example. Hit OK, and we'll see that now calculated as 54. If we look at the 4th, we should increase that a little bit. We're looking at 68. And of course, I can break that out now by any of my other attributes. And to break that out by country, for example, then we can see the month-to-date values for each of those items. Again, we're not looking at sales now. Let's bring units in as well. And we'll see those values actually showing up here as well. So there's my month-to-date values on there. We can see that from my Australia, France, United Kingdom, United States, etc. And again, in this case, now we're actually choosing the date that's going to be acting as my current member, and it'll calculate the month to date for that particular month. So again, let's go back, for example, to previous year. So let's go back to 2018, for example. Let's take May the 10th and hit OK. We're going to calculate that then, in this case, for May the 10th. So month to date is created in that way. Week to date and year to date done in exactly the same way with that particular block. Okay, let's just pop back to my slides. Next one on our list was percent of parent. So in this case, we're looking here at the case using what's called hierarchies or regular hierarchies in order to actually look at my values. Now, when you're building your models, you have, I can leave my sort of attributes flat if you like. So I have a list of products, a list of product categories, a list of product subcategories, and so on. But I can organize those into a hierarchy using the hierarchy dialog in my model build, in my model app. And I can create actually two types of hierarchy, one which is called a drill path and the other which is called a regular hierarchy. A drill path will effectively, if I drill down, for example, from category to subcategory, it will replace the column category with the column subcategory in my query with the values for the particular category that I drill down on. When I'm working as a regular hierarchy, then I will actually drill down within the column with that regular hierarchy name. I can also expand and collapse down to child members as well. A regular hierarchy also allows me to perform positional calculations on my attribute. So I can choose the level, I can choose the parent, the child, the descendants, and so on. I can prove previous, next, first child, last child, and so on and so forth. So it allows me to navigate my hierarchical structure as part of my calculation activity. So in this case, we're saying, in this case, how do I calculate percent of parents? Well, it's going to be the sales for the item I'm looking at divided by the value for the item I'm looking at divided by the value for its parent. And whatever value I'm looking at, we can look at its relative parent in order to perform that calculation. So I'm looking at two data points, one which is simply the sales value, where it is encountered in the grid. And then I want to divide that by the sales value for that particular item's parent. So if I'm looking at a subcategory, for example, of bikes, then for each individual bike model or product category, product, then I will look for the total for that in that particular category and divide my sales value by that amount. So again, in this case, we can see I'm using my products hierarchy. And my products hierarchy, we're looking at each of my individual values of sales for accessories at the category level, mountain bikes at the subcategory level. And then I'm calculating the percent of parent for each of those items. So in this case, it's 3,386,000 and something divided by 18 million and so on for this one. To calculate the 92% will be the 18 million and something divided by the total for accessories, bikes, clothing, and components. And we also have that concept of the all level that you can also add into the model, looking at the top level. Again, from a calculation point of view, pyramid will be the data's sales as my measure. Divided by the sales for the parent of the current member, i.e. the row that I'm looking at in this particular case. So again, building that out, let's skip across. Again, let's go back to my discovery mode here. I'm going to set up my grid. So I'm going to take out my data. And I'm going to remove my month to date value from here and my country. And I'm going to replace that with my product category. And I have a hierarchy, a regular hierarchy called products, which I can drop into my rows. And you can see I can expand and expand down within the same column. Again, other products working with hierarchies, whether they're intrinsic, working with analysis services or SAP BW, or defined within that product, they tend to, when I expand down, they tend to add additional columns. In Pyramid, we work with hierarchies natively, as you'd expect them to work, working with a dimensional data structure. So I need to build my percent of parent, excuse me. Again, if I look at my elements here, we can see in this case, I actually do have this all level. Again, this is the ability to create an all level was introduced a couple of versions ago of Pyramid. When I'm defining my regular hierarchies, I can optionally add that all level at the top. And of course, that's useful when I'm wanting to do things like percent of total when I'm looking at the top level in terms of my categories here. So again, let's create my new calc. I'm going to take the shortcut way to my formula and get rid of that one. And I want to take the data point. So I want to take any value of sales that I come across. So choose my measure. We're going to choose my sales item. And then I want to divide it by another version of sales. And again, I want to choose the measure. It's going to be sales. But then I want it for the parent of whichever of the row it is that I'm looking at there. So in this case, what I want to do is my, say, current member. So I'll go to my products and I'm looking at my hierarchy. And again, I can expand this out to choose the value I want. But in this case, I want this to be dynamically allocated based on what's in the grid. So again, I got my little FX functions here. And again, in this case, I can choose my parents. Notice that in my regular hierarchy, I have a lot more positional capability than I do just in a flat one. In a flat hierarchy, as we saw with my date, I simply had go back an amount, go forward an amount, next, previous, or current. I can add to that with my regular hierarchies in terms of parents, first child, first sibling, last sibling, cousin, also known as parallel period, or ancestor, or what level I want to go up to find its grandparent, great grandparent, etc. So in this case, I want that to be the parent. And again, in this case, we've got sales already defined. So again, I can save this. So we can call this one my percent of parent, and we'll save that. Again, check the syntax, it passed. Again, we'll have an empty result because I don't have a context for my current member as yet. In this case, I can save this. And I've saved that already. I can go pop back to my discovery. Again, I should see my little window pop up here with my measures. There it is. And on my work group, in my 5 calculations, I've got my percent of parent. So I'll notice at the moment I haven't got my formatting. So let's go back and reset that. On the right-hand panel of panes, we've got my context in which the calculation sits. In this case, we're doing a calculation between 2 measures effectively, different versions of the same measure. So it's going to sit in my measures dimension. And my format, which is going to be, let's give it 2 decimal places. Let's just save that again, re-execute my query just to bring in my new percentages, and there we go. So again, because this calculation is using that current member and parent as effectively kind of relative positions, current member will take any row or column or filter value that contains the an attribute or an element from my products hierarchy and use that to define the current member. So in this case, again, as I expand bikes down, we can see now I'm calculating the percentage parent of mountain bikes to bikes. And again, if I expand down again, I'm comparing the percentage of parent of my mountain 100 black 38 to my subcategory or my category mountain bikes. So again, again, I can expand those down. Similarly, in terms of clothing or whatever it might be. And of course, using regular hierarchies, you can drill down directly to a particular level, like clothing, for example, and see that percentage there. Again, right click and drill up. You can look at that again. It's given me in this case, it's now the percentages of all of my subcategories to that particular category, and drill up again to my categories, which is showing me now as a percentage of all of the categories in my model. So that's my percent of parent. Let's tab back to my presentation. And the first thing, I was looking at dynamic cumulative totals. And in this case, I'm looking at creating the calculation. And we're looking here, in this case, also at the difference between my context calculation and my semantic calculations. One of the areas we can show a little bit of the difference. So again, I have a calculation, and again, using the current member function allows me to effectively take each current member and add it to the cumulative total of the previous one and back through the beginning. So I can define a dynamic range saying go from this element to this element and define that. And again, use the current member to do that, to create my cumulative totals. So let's take a look at that. Again, if I look at the output of my calculation, it will use the range function, say go from this date to that date, and then add up all of the dates that range function will return. So in this case, we're taking the September as my month, and I'm looking at to say add up that range from the September 2017 to whichever row I'm looking at that particular time. And of course, as I go down each row, that will increase the range that I'm adding up, and will obviously then add up those values on an incremental basis to give the cumulative value for that range of months. So again, let's have a look at that in terms of my both the context and the semantic version of those two things. Pop back to pyramid. Let's create a new view. And this time I'm going to take the full month name, and we'll drop that into my grid. And we're going to take my sales value. Here we go. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. So there's my 4 month name. I want to create that cumulative total. So I want to take the starting point, let's say of October 2017. And then I want to add that a range up to the current member of this particular grid. So if I start at October 17, for the first row, it will just give me October the 17 as the values that fall within that range. For the next row, it will give me October and November 2017, then October, November, December 17, added up, and so on down through my list. Now, if I do that, let's create my calculation. Again, formula. This time I want a range list. So if my element blocks, I can just drop my range list in. And I want to start with let's say the first value that's in my system, which is October 2017. And that's going to be set. So that's kind of explicit. And will be static at October 2017. The end point of my range, though, I'm going to make variable by, again, using that custom or current member function. So again, click on my little FX here and choose current member. Again, if I execute that, of course, that's going to return a set or a list of output, i.e. the list of all of the months that fall within this particular range. So again, I want to add those up. And I could use aggregate, or I could use sum. In this case, it doesn't make any difference. And again, execute again. Okay, syntactically, we're okay with that. So let's save that. And this time I want to call that cumulative sales. And I accidentally hit the caps lock. Never mind. Let's save that. Go back to my discovery. And this time I'm going to choose my cumulative item. So saved in my 5 calculations folder. Let's add that in, and we can see that added up now. So we can see here in this case that I've now got my cumulative values and 66 through there, and I was going to add those all up. So each value is added in term, each row, my range increases by 1, and we add all the values for that range or set of or list of items. In this particular case, if I change this in a sec, I want to apply my context calculation to that. So for sales, I want to create a cumulative total. And we can see now my cumulative total is calculated in my context calcs is exactly the same as cumulative total of my that I calculated in Formulate. Watch what happens though if I change the months that I select in here. So if I go and view my elements in here and say, let's take, I don't know, let's take these half a dozen or so months and execute that. What do you notice? Well, we notice that my cumulative sales as defined in my context calc is only acting on the data returned by the query, whereas my cumulative sales is always giving me the cumulative total for my start point, which was October 2017. So even though none of 2017 values appear in my grid, I'm still calculating the cumulative total from the beginning of the model rather than from the beginning of the data that's returned by the query. Hence the term semantic calculations, hence the term context calculations. So it depends which one you want. There's different ways of going about it. In some instances, they will return the same value, but in other instances, they won't. And it's important that you understand the difference between them. Okay, let's look back and realize we're running out of time. Maybe we can rerun this one without the technical issues where we're not to do that. So maybe I have done a total of 5 now if we include these 2 different versions. So again, here, like at cumulative totals, in this case, different way of calculating those using a regular hierarchy. In some instances, for example, I may want to look at my cumulative total from the start of each year or from the start of each month or whatever, again, resetting it back to 0 at the beginning of each one of those. So again, in this case, when we were looking at my date hierarchy, if I've got it defined as a regular hierarchy, I can use the hierarchical positional definitions and functions to actually achieve what I'm looking for. So again, in this case, we're looking now, you can see as I open up my time hierarchy from years to quarters to months to dates, that I'm resetting my cumulative total at the start of each of those levels. So when I change from 18 to 19, I reset my cumulative total. When I change from quarter 1 to quarter 2, I'm resetting it, and so on as I go down those values. So again, how do we go about doing that? So in this case, I'm using the current member first sibling function to actually get the first occurrence of all of the members within that group, if you like. So all of the members of June in terms of dates, June 2019. If I choose any of those dates, like the 5th of June, its first sibling will be the 1st of June. The first sibling of June 2019 will be April, because those are the 3 months within that quarter. The first sibling of Q2 2019 will be Q1 2019, because these are within my year. These are siblings within 2019. So let's finish with that one as we run out of time. Let's just jump back into Pyramid. Let's create a new view, and this time I'm going to use my time hierarchy. And we'll use my date hierarchy. That's the one with months in it. And let's stick my sales values in there for that. And what I want to do is to create my calculation using the regular hierarchy. So again, in this case, I want to set a formula. I'm going to create my range list again, but this time when I'm using my hierarchy, I'm going to choose to say, well, I want the start point to be the first sibling, like so, and my end point to be the current member, like that. Of course, I want to add that up, so I will stick that in my brackets. And of course, again, I could specify a different measure if I wanted to do cumulative values for a different measure rather than the default. Again, test that. We're looking okay for that. Let's save that. So let's call that cumulative sales 2, regular hierarchy, and save it. And pop back to my view here. Okay, well, I've got that one here. Yeah, pop back to my view. And on my measures, we'll take my 5 calcs, take my regular hierarchy one here, and you can see. So in this case, I'm got cumulative values for my years. If I open up 2018, you can see I have cumulative values for my quarters for 2018, cumulative values for the quarters for 2019. Within Q2, we can see again, I'm resetting now within each quarter for cumulative based on months. And within each month, we've got a cumulative value resetting to 0 at the start of each month for the dates. So I'm going to leave it at that. We're kind of running over time. We've probably covered about 5 calcs. There's a couple, maybe we can come back and have a look at those another day. So at that point, let's leave it at that. Josh, happy to take any questions. Apologies again for the late start. Again, it was due to circumstances outside of my control based upon what Zoom was playing at. So happy to take any questions right now if you've got any.
No worries, Ian. I think with regards to time, respect to time, we'll just go ahead and wrap things up. So yeah, I think that should do it. As a reminder for those still on the line, we will send a replay of this event. Should be in a little bit today, depending on how quickly Zoom turns it around. So keep an eye on your inbox. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. You can either reply to the email that we send out, and we'll make sure it gets to the right person, or you can send a message to us directly through the Contact Us page on the website. That all said, we do thank you for your time, and we hope this has been a beneficial use of your time as you seek out solutions for data and analytics. Thank you for attending, and have a great rest of your day.